Here we are, still here after weeks of lockdown. And I don't know about you, but I'm talking to the furniture. And the furniture's talking back. The teacups are pretty chatty. And there's a tree outside my window, just won't shut up. But luckily we have the World's Storytelling Cafe bringing us stories every single day. And I'm very lucky to be one of their number. Well, it's getting to midsummer, and so it's time for those stories of the other people, the little folk, the fairies. I'm lucky enough to have a fairy story in my own family. My husband found it in an old notebook when he was researching family history, and it's about his great-great-great-uncle Jack Leeper. And Jack Leeper lived in Donegal in Ireland, in the little village of Welshtown. So Welshtown is really just a row of farms on the top of a hill, and the main road from Stranora, the big town, goes along the bottom of the valley, all the way from Stranora in the east to, the ocean in the west. One Friday night, Jack Leeper had been raking. So I thought this was an agricultural pursuit, but no. It's what young men did on a Friday night in Stranora. And Jack and his friend were coming home from a very successful evening's raking. And their voices, they were loud and joyful, and their feet were a little bit unsteady on the road. But all the same, when they got back to the little path that led up the hill to Jack's farm, Jack's friend looked him up and down, and decided he'd probably make it up to the top on his own. So they said goodbye, and Jack started up the lane. But just as he got to his own farmyard, he heard strange voices calling out, "Saddle us a horse! Saddle us a horse!" Well, Jack had a very good night's raking, and he was feeling very pleased with himself, and he couldn't resist it. He said, "Well, saddle me a horse as well." And at once, fairy hands lifted him up and put him on the back of an invisible horse, and he was whirled away over the countryside, over fields, over hills, over woods, until suddenly everything went black. And the next thing he knew, there was bright sunlight beating down on his head, and he was lying in the ditch on the wrong side of Stranora. And it said it took him a long time to get home that morning, because every time he saw somebody coming towards him, he'd have to hide in the ditch so they wouldn't see him in the state he was in, him in his Friday best suit. And he hoped that the story would never get out. But here I am, telling it you today. Story of Jack Leeper and the Fairies. Ireland has some pretty good stories, but there are some stories about fairies in England as well. And this one's a favourite. It's called The Fairy Ointment. The old midwife, she very often had a girl living in to help about the house. She'd train her up and send her on to some good position. But she'd never had one like Betsy. Never had one she feared for quite so much. So innocent, so open to danger. She did the best she could. She found a ring of cold iron. She strung it on a string for an amulet and gave it to Betsy. Betsy was delighted. She'd never been given a present before, let alone a bed of her own and a little room of her own to sleep in, the garret with its little window looking out over to the field, the fairy field with the long grass waving. And oh, she'd wanted to help, but it was difficult. She broke things, she dropped things, she forgot things. And worst of all was the spinning. Betsy could not spin. She tangled the wool, she broke the thread, and if she did manage to spin a little bit, it was all tangled and lumpy. One night, the midwife had brought home a big bag of wool, and Betsy knew there was going to be spinning the next day. And she stood that night at her bedroom window, sobbing her eyes out, looking out at the moonlight on the fairy field, when suddenly she heard voices. "Betsy, Betsy, why are you crying?" "I'm crying because of the spinning," said Betsy. "Spinning! We love spinning! Come and bring us your spinning and we'll do it for you." Now Betsy knew very well she was not supposed to go in the fairy field, especially not in moonlight near midsummer. But she was desperate. She tiptoed down the stairs. She found her old wooden spindle and the bag of wool. She edged open the door and she slipped out. And there in the field were the fairy folk, some of them singing, some of them dancing. Fairy hands grabbed the wool, grabbed the spindle and started to spin. Some of the dancers said, "Come and join us in the dance," and Betsy held out her hand. But they said, "No, you'll have to take that amulet off. We can't touch you while you're wearing cold iron." But Betsy did know better than to take that amulet off, so she left it where it was. Well, Betsy's spinning improved by leaps and bounds. The old midwife looked at her work and she shook her head, but she didn't say anything. But one morning she went to rouse Betsy. Betsy was gone. The whole village went out looking for her. They even dragged the pond. But the midwife, she'd found the old wooden spindle in the field, and tangled in Betsy's bedclothes, she found that amulet, its string frayed and snapped. And she knew Betsy was gone. She didn't expect ever to see her again. Well, days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, and it was winter. It was just that time of year when autumn is turning into frost and chill. And the old midwife was sitting by the fire. She was all bundled up in coats and shawls, but she hadn't gone to bed because she'd got a couple of women near their time and she just felt she might be needed that night. Sure enough, a knock at the door. But when she opened it, it was not the young farmhand she'd been expecting, but a fine gentleman, all dressed in silks and satins, and behind him a black stallion, shifting its weight from one great hoof to the other, and the light from the fire inside flickered on the silver of his bridle. The gentleman said, "Midwife, will you come? My woman's near her time and she's in a bad way." Fine gentleman or no, the midwife could hear the trouble in his voice. So she went, she got her bag, and she climbed up on the horse behind the fine gentleman, and they were off, trotting through the village, cantering, galloping across the road so lightly it seemed as if their hooves were not touching the ground. And then the midwife looked down, and the horse's hooves were not touching the ground. She was flying over the fields, over the hills, over the woods, until suddenly she saw a hill. They were headed straight for it. She shut her eyes, and when she opened it, the horse was putting its hooves down lightly on a cobbled ground outside a big mansion. Well, the gentleman, he helped her off the horse and he led the way through the house, down long corridors to a great bedroom. It was a fine room, a marble fireplace with a great fire burning, a carved ceiling, strange plants and snakes and dragons, and a 4-poster bed with a woman in a fine lace nightgown. And the midwife could see 2 things at once. The woman did need her help. And secondly, that woman was Betsy. She chased the gentleman away, she got her things all ready, and then she sat near Betsy. She helped her through her time, soothing her and talking to her. And at last, the baby was born. The gentleman came in and she put the baby in his arms. And there was that look between father and mother and child. And the midwife could see that Betsy was happier than she'd ever seen her. But the baby, it was lying there with its eyes scrunched up tight against the light. And the father, he took out a jar of ointment and he handed it to the midwife. And he said, when the baby opens his eyes, put the ointment on them. But make sure you don't have any left behind on your hand. And then he handed the baby back to the midwife. And Betsy, she was exhausted. She drifted off to sleep. And the midwife wrapped the baby and washed him. When he opened his eyes, he saw these bright, bright eyes looking at her. And she remembered the ointment and she smeared a little bit over each eye. And then she sat back in the chair and nursed the baby by the fire. And oh, she was tired. She rubbed her eyes. And at once, the whole room changed. They were not in a fine bedroom, but a little low cave. Just a few twigs burning where there had been a marble fireplace. Roots twisting through an earth ceiling. And Betsy, dressed in rags, lying on a pile of old leaves. And when the fairy man came in, she could see he was not tall and dressed in silks and satins. No, he was as ragged as Betsy and twisted, and he didn't look at her quite straight. But he told her it was time to go, and she said nothing of what she'd seen or done, but just followed the gentleman out. And where there had been a great black stallion, there was an old broom handle. And they got on the broom handle as if it was a child's toy, but that broom handle, it whirled them back to the midwife's house as quickly as ever it had brought her. And as she turned to go inside, the fairy man gave her a bag. There's gold for you. Thank you, he said. And the midwife, she didn't think too much of that because she knew about fairy gold, how it turns to dust in your fingers. But the next morning when she looked in the bag, gold it still was. So the next market day, she went off to buy herself a treat. And it was a bright, crisp winter's day with the sun shining on the stalls of warm woolen shawls, of crisp apples, of cheeses in mounds. And as she was wandering up and down, looking at this, feeling that, who who should she see but the fairy gentleman? He had a wallet over his shoulder, and he was walking up and down the stalls, and he was taking things, an apple here, a bottle there, shoving them in the wallet. And nobody seemed to be taking any notice. Well, she didn't know what to do. But he came right close to her. And so she said, "And how's your wife? And your fine baby?" And the ferryman jumped, he turned round, he looked at her, and he said, "Which eye can you see me with?" And Betsy thought, "Can't see with that eye. It's this one." And at once the ferryman jabbed a finger into Betsy's eye. Oh, the pain! And when she could open her eye again, although this eye could see as well as ever, the other eye was completely black. She could not see the human world or the fairy world, not for the rest of her days. And that's the story of the fairy midwife. The human world and the fairy world, both of them seen together. A few years ago, a friend of mine paid me a compliment. I'd mentioned something odd I'd noticed, and she said, "That's just like you, Marion. Always see things a bit differently from everybody else." And I treasured that compliment. Before then, I'd never really mentioned to anybody about my squint, my eye cast, and because I didn't talk about it, nor did anybody else. But not long after that compliment, I went to the optician's, got my first pair of glasses. And I started telling that story of the fairy ointment. And isn't that what storytellers do? See the human world and the fairy world and put them together in a story. Well, I've got one more improbable story. We've had one about great-great-uncle Jack, so it's time for a story about Aunt Ruthie. Aunt Ruthie, best of aunts. She was the bravest, she was the wisest. She'd had the most adventures of anyone I knew. And did she tell stories of those adventures? One of her adventures, it was a lockdown adventure. And it happened when Aunt Ruthie was really young, and it was in the 1930s, and she was working for the Foreign Office in Peking. And Chiang Kai-shek's army was marching on Peking. So all foreign nationals were ordered to stay indoors. And for the British Foreign Office, that meant a big compound. Well, Aunt Ruthie, she wasn't a city girl, really. She couldn't imagine a whole summer in Peking in one compound. But she knew a little cottage in the mountains. She'd be perfectly safe, nobody would find her there. She set off straight away. She stopped off on the way to get some emergency shopping. She even got a wheelbarrow, piled it all in the wheelbarrow, and once she got to the cottage, she began to unpack the shopping. Well, the thing she was really proud of, she'd got a huge bag of red beans. Red beans in China in those days, they were like toilet paper, tinned tomatoes and pasta all mixed in together. They were the thing you wanted. But she got some other things as well. She got a flat iron. Do you remember the lockdown days when you thought ironing was going to be important? She'd got a jug, a useful jug, but when she put it down on the floor near the sink, a little turtle crept along the floor and jumped into the jug as if that was going to be its home from now on. She'd got a screwdriver and a lump of blue tack, because Aunt Ruthie says you can fix pretty much anything with either a screwdriver or blue tack. She got some things to keep her amused. Some marbles and a yoga mat. Keep an eye on that shopping. If I leave any of it out, the whole story's going to go wrong. Aunt Ruthie unpacked the shopping and put the red beans on to cook. She was famous for her red bean stew. But just as the smell of it began to fill the cottage, there was a knock at the door. Outside was standing a figure that made Aunt Ruthie's blood run cold. He was dressed all in animal skins of yellow and brown. He had ferocious moustaches and piercing amber eyes. He was bristling with weapons, daggers and guns and an ammunition belt. Aunt Ruthie knew very well who it was. It was the most dangerous bandit of the whole mountain, the mountain tiger. "Are you cooking red bean stew?" said the mountain tiger. "Yes," said Aunt Ruthie. "Good. My men and I, we're hungry. We will have your red bean stew." "Over my dead body," said Aunt Ruthie. Sometimes she was a little bit too brave. "Over your dead body if you like," said the mountain tiger, reaching for his pistol. "Well, don't kill me now," said Aunt Ruthie, thinking a bit too quickly. "If you kill me now, the bean stew's not cooked. You'll never know how delicious my red bean stew is." "Very well," said the mountain tiger. "I will be back in 1 hour, and then I will have the stew over your dead body." And he was gone. Well, Aunt Ruthie, she'd bought herself 1 more hour of life, and it didn't seem like very much. She went back and started to stir that stew, but as she stirred, tears rolled down her face and fell in the pot. And soon she was sobbing her heart out until she heard a voice, a kind of snapping voice. "Why are you crying so much?" It was the turtle in the jug. "I'm crying because the mountain tiger is going to kill me and eat my stew," said Aunt Ruthie. "Not red bean stew," said the turtle. "It's my very favourite food. Give me some red bean stew and maybe I can help you against the mountain tiger." And just then there was a kind of gravelly, rumbling voice. "Oh, we'd like to try red bean stew as well." It was the bag of marbles on the shelf. And then a kind of flapping sound. That was the yoga mat. It wanted red bean stew as well. And it turned out that so did the screwdriver, so did the blue tack, so did the flat iron, and even the wheelbarrow. And they all agreed that if Aunt Ruthie fed them, they would help her against the mountain bandit. So when the stew was ready, Aunt Ruthie fed the turtle, the marbles, the screwdriver, the yoga mat, the blue tack, the flat iron, and there was even some left over for the wheelbarrow. And then, not feeling like eating herself, she went and lay on the mat in the corner of her bed and prepared herself for death, while the shopping went into a little huddle and plotted together. 5 minutes later, the door was flung open and in strode the mountain tiger. He put one foot across the threshold and landed on the marbles, which were rolling about on the floor. He skidded and he tumbled and he fell, sitting heavily on the screwdriver, which was pointing straight up in the air. Oh, he yowled and leapt in the air, and his hand came down smack on the blue tack. And as he tried to pull it off the hair of his beautiful fur gloves, he spotted the jug of water in the corner. He plunged his hand, glove and all, into the jug, and the snapping turtle bit it. He leapt in the air, howling again, hit his head on the beam, dislodged the flat iron, which fell on top of him, knocked him out cold, and he fell on the yoga mat, which rolled him up, tipped him into the wheelbarrow, and the wheelbarrow trundled him all the way back to the camp of the bandits, where it tipped him out. And that bandit never came back to Aunt Ruthie for the rest of lockdown. And what's more, her store of beans lasted until it was time to go home. And that's the story of Aunt Ruthie and the mountain tiger. And I hope that your lockdown shopping has been as useful over the weeks and that you've had many stories to feed you. Thank you for listening. And that's the story of Aunt Ruthie's lockdown shopping. I hope your lockdown shopping's been as successful as hers. There is actually a whole tradition of telling stories about random objects. The Brothers Grimm did it all the time. It's not just me. They put loads of them in their collection. And so as we've got a few more minutes, I'll tell you my favourite. The reason I like it is because usually when I tell it, I ask the audience to suggest the furniture and the objects that go in the story. And that way, I get a different story every time. So today, if you would like to replace the objects I use in the story with objects of your own that you can see around the space where you are sitting listening, why then you'll have a perfectly personalised version of the story for yourself. So feel free to do that. But the story begins like this. There was once a girl with beautiful long hair. It was thick, it was shiny, it was clean. But that little girl's hair, it itched. It itched all over. And any parent among you will know that what was making it itch was head lice. One little louse was enough to set her whole head itching. But that little louse, it loved that girl's head. It was like a whole enchanted kingdom. It was like a forest. He decided to settle in, decided to make himself a house, right up against the base of one of the strands of hair, which for him was like a great tall tree. He was a conscientious louse. He built the house all properly, lovely fireplace, all the rooms you need, moved his furniture in, his great carved chair inherited from a great aunt. He even made himself a garden and planted sweet geraniums. And when he was done, when he'd moved in, he started to make himself a celebration meal. He put on a great pot of soup, and he was sitting stirring the soup and stirring the soup. And suddenly he realised he was feeling a bit sad. Couldn't think what it was. And then he realised he was lonely. Head lice are very gregarious creatures. As any parent will tell you, where there's one, there's usually lots. But here was this little louse all on his own. I don't know what would have happened to him except very luckily at that exact moment, a little spider on a long thread of grey silk came floating through the air and landed on the girl's head. And little Louse was delighted. "Welcome," he said. "Come on in, I'm just making soup." And so little Louse and little Spider, together they stirred the soup and stirred the soup, tasted the soup. Ah! It was disgusting. "It needs salt," said little Louse. "There'll be some out there somewhere. Humans naturally excrete salt through their heads." He was a very well-informed little Louse. "I'll go and get some, you stay and stir the soup." And so off went little Louse to get the salt, and little Spider stirred and stirred the soup and stirred the soup. Suddenly, she began to feel very uncomfortable. She began to itch all over. That's what happens if you spend too long near head lice. She couldn't bear it in that house another moment, so she spun herself a long thread of grey silk, and she drifted off that little girl's head. I don't know where. Out of the story. Drifting in, drifting out. That's how it is with spiders. But when little Louse came back with the salt, he couldn't see little Spider anyway. He looked around the fireplace. He looked under the chair. He looked out in the garden. And then he looked in the pot of soup. "Oh no," said little Louse to himself. "Little Spider must have fallen in the soup and drowned." Little Louse was so upset he began to cry. Great big fat tears splashed into the soup and onto the fire. And the fire said, "Little Louse, why are you splashing tears all over me? I'm getting wet." "I'm crying," said little Louse, "because little Spider has fallen in the soup and drowned." "Oh, that is quite sad," said little Fire. "If I could cry I would, but that's very bad for fires. I will crackle instead." So little Louse cried and little Fire crackled. Crackled so loudly that the great aunt's chair heard him. "Fire, why are you crackling?" said the chair. "I'm crackling because little Louse is crying. Little Louse is crying because little Spider fell in the soup and drowned." "Oh, how terrible," said the chair. "If I could cry I would, but it's very bad for my stuffing. I will creak instead." So little Louse cried, and little Fire crackled, and little chair creaked. She creaked so loudly that out in the garden the sweet geranium heard her. "Little chair, why are you creaking?" "I am creaking because little Fire is crackling. Little Fire is crackling because little Louse is crying. Little Louse is crying because little Spider fell in the soup and drowned." "Oh, that's terrible," said the geranium. "If I could cry, I would, but geraniums can't. I will." There always comes one moment in the story where you realise you've got an object that it's really hard to think of a noise for them. I will throw myself around and batter and bruise my leaves," said the geranium. So there was little Louse crying, and little Fire crackling, and little chair creaking, and little geranium battering and bruising her leaves so that the smell of them rose in the air and came to the attention of the great big comb in the air above the girl's head. "What is that smell, little geranium?" said the great big comb. The smell is because I am battering and bruising my leaves, said the geranium. And I am battering and bruising my leaves because little chair is creaking because little fire is crackling because little louse is crying because little spider fell in the soup and drowned. Oh, what a terrible disaster, said the great big comb. If I could cry, I could, but combs don't. So I will do what combs do best. And the great big comb started to comb the little girl's hair. And he combed away the geranium, and he combed away the chair, and he combed away the fire, and he combed away the pot, and he combed away the house, and he combed away little louse. And the little girl's head did not itch any more. And that's the end of that story, and of my stories this evening. Thank you for listening. And thank you to the World Storytelling Cafe for hosting me. If you like the stories, there are many, many more to listen to on the World Storytelling Cafe site. Thank you. Good night.
Young and old, you've been listening to a wonderful storyteller. And if you really liked it, if you've got a little money, doesn't have to be a lot. A little goes a long, long way, as they say. And you can afford it. Just pop it into the storyteller's hat, because right now they're not earning at all, so whatever you've got, it will be appreciated. And I'm sure you parents will have set a good example for your children. Oh, it's lovely. I'm only joking. But it will keep some of us going through this crisis. And those of you that are self-employed out there will know exactly what I mean, and you're probably exempt.